Yes?
Yeah.
Okay back there? Let's begin with a word of prayer. Gracious God, we thank you for the many, many blessings you've given us. We thank you for one another. We thank you for our church. But most of all, we thank you for our Lord Jesus Christ. We pray that as we look at history and how people interpreted him and what happened between groups, that you would guide us to help us understand that we need to be together with other Christians. So bless our study and guide us in all that we say and do. In Christ's name we pray. Amen. Okay, I said before, come on, you turn on, it turned on. We're going to go through about 44 slides tonight. So they're going to go pretty quickly. And especially the first 8 or so. But there might be some questions when we get to 8 or 9 about fellowship and what it means and all that. And after that, then we're going to have a flag contest. And you will have to identify the flag before we get to the country. And so we'll see how this goes. So let's give it a shot. Okay, we're going to talk about coming to America, and you can almost take these backwards. Who do we cooperate with? Who are our partners? And then ultimately we're going to get to our roots. It won't take us long to get to our roots if I don't stab myself. I've already lost this thing once tonight. Okay, remember we went through these last week, all the different groups that came together to make the ELCA. I put them up there to show you there were a few. And we're going to hit some of them. Why so many? Because we talked last week about ethnicity, distances, and communication. And this becomes kind of important. Still not many English materials. There's one place I'll probably tell you about, Ben Franklin. This is who we are, ELCA, fourth largest Protestant group in America, 3.6 million baptized members. Notice Protestant group, there are many Catholics in the United States. Where our headquarters are in Chicago, guided by Bishop Eaton. She's elected for a 6-year term and she can be re-elected once. The same is true of the bishops of the 65 synods, which are mostly geographical. Mostly geographical until you get into kind of the outer hinterlands. For instance, we talked last week about how many different states are in the New England Synod. Then we have the Southeastern Synod, which is above us. But Southeastern Synod would be Georgia, Alabama, Tennessee, and there's one other state in there. They comprise Southeastern Synod. But where you have a state, for instance, that has at least 150 churches or 140 churches, that would be a synod. That's how the church divided itself up. We have 9 regions, 240 missionaries, half of whom are lay people, and 9,000 congregations throughout the United States and Alaska and the Bahamas. We have 1, and St. Croix we have 2. Puerto Rico we have 35. 17,000 pastors. And we're at the point in our church right now where we have as many pastors retiring as we do coming out of seminary. And so it creates a dearth of pastors. We need pastors quite badly at this point. 26 colleges and universities. This is a result of mergers. I'll be mentioning some of them tonight. But we have 26 located throughout the United States, beginning, well, closest one to here might be Newberry up in South Carolina. North Carolina, you have Lenoir-Rhyne. Pennsylvania, you have Muhlenberg, Gettysburg, Thiel, all in one state. Those are all ELCA schools. You get to the Midwest, you end up with Wartburg and Luther and all other kinds go on. South, northwest, Pacific Lutheran. Southwest, you got California Lutheran. And there are 8 seminaries. Those I can probably name, but they are now becoming part of the universities. We're creating schools of theology within universities, and it helps save a lot on administrative costs, as well as allowing people to teach back and forth. Those. Why were they not put in there originally? Some of them were. Go ahead, Roger. Why weren't they put in there originally?
Why were they not put in there originally?
Well, there are some of them that are not located adjacent. You know, how would they, and here, you know, we overcome communication problems. Let's overcome transportation problems. For instance, Lutheran Theological Southern Seminary, Columbia, South Carolina, is now School of Theology of Lenoir-Rhyne University in North Carolina. They're about 140 miles apart, but we've learned that we can do that through all the communication and what we have. So before, when the church merged in '88, we didn't have all these electronic gadgets, and they didn't want some seminaries to be favored over others because they were located adjacent to a university. So,
Would any of what you were just discussing have to do with the separation of state and
no,
religion?
No.
It wouldn't.
no. As it ends up, there are those in seminaries who can get federal loans for their education as well as those in college. That would be the big separation there. The 8 seminaries, and there's one interesting one that I'll come upon in a little while, but we can start with where we are, Lutheran Theological Southern Seminary, Columbia, South Carolina. Go on up to Philadelphia, you have Philadelphia Lutheran Seminary, Gettysburg Lutheran Seminary. Then you can go on over to Ohio and have Trinity. I'm up to 4, right? Okay, that's where I went to school, at Trinity, which at that time was Evangelical Lutheran Theological School. And then you go, we have Chicago Lutheran, so I'm up to 5. Luther Seminary in St. Paul, Minnesota is 6. Wartburg in Dubuque, Iowa is 7. And Pacific Lutheran Seminary was located in Berkeley, and they've now merged with somebody or joined together. And so they went to that campus because our campus was landlocked terribly. As you know, California real estate's very expensive. So those are our 8 seminaries. And the seminary presidents come together with the 9 regions, each have one of their bishops, and that's how they divide up, as they did a couple weeks ago, as to where the graduates of this year, which I think there were somewhere in the neighborhood of 140 graduates from our seminaries, and they then choose which ones are going to go where. And there are, of course, some favored ones, and then there are those that are at the bottom of the pile. And nothing personal, but we used to say they end up in North Dakota. Had a good friend who was a class ahead of me. Ron died a very early death of a heart attack, but he knew that he was going to get sent there, so he was prepared. And he got to North Dakota, and he started publishing a newsletter that he sent back to the seminary, and the students could all read it, called The Badlands Bugle. And he talked about the gun that he carried in his car for snakes, and how he'd put a notch in it every time he killed another snake. And I think in his parish, he had to cross a river, but he didn't want to go all the way up to where the bridge was, so he had his car hoisted up a little bit so he could get through the river. Really a character, but a great pastor. The people loved him. And after he died, they even published a book of his sermons. And this was a smaller church. Okay, largest nonprofit social service system in America. That includes the Good Samaritan Society, which they've been advertising on TV if you watch some sports, as I sometimes do. Just ask, she's got a straight face. But we had the TV man out today because changing over cable companies save $100 a month to get the same thing. If you're interested, see us afterwards. We don't get a cut on it. But the guy was back out there, and I said, this TV only gets pucks and balls. And so we're taping hockey right now.
And race cars.
And yeah, occasionally we watch them. I'm not quite as interested as I used to be. Is that right?
In what?
Race cars.
Okay.
Okay. Today in the United States, there are 8.7 million Lutherans, 21 different Lutheran bodies. That's synods. Like we are ELCA, we are the largest. And Missouri, so you'll see up here in a minute, Missouri Synod has 2.6 million. So between the two of us, we have 6.2 million out of the 8.7. Wisconsin Evangelical Lutheran Synod has 400,000. They're the third largest. And the other 18 are here, there, and everywhere. These three comprise 95% of the Lutherans in America. Okay, today in the world, this becomes interesting. There are 80 million Lutherans. Last week I put in there 60 million. But I went home and I did some more research and I checked my arithmetic and it came out closer to 80 million Lutherans, and that's what was also stated. Now, here is where they're located. If they're over 1 million members, I have them up there. Germany, look at Ethiopia is the number 2 largest Lutheran gathering of people in the world. Why is that? Well, number one, back in 1960, early 61, 62, Emperor Haile Selassie invited us to come over and create the Lutheran Church in Ethiopia. Now, he was a Coptic Christian, and he invited us because he was having some struggles with the Coptic Christian church. They didn't want to expand. And so we went with one condition. We could not evangelize. We could not go out and evangelize the people of Ethiopia. However, we could go over there and teach their people how to go out and evangelize. And that's why the church grew so big, so fast. Till today, 50 years later, you've got 7.9 million. North America, we already hit the 8.7. Tanzania, another African country, 6.5 million. Sweden, state church. Indonesia, 6 million Lutherans in Indonesia. Finland, 4.6 million. Denmark, 4.5. India, if you look at India like this, over on this side is the South Andhras province of India, and it's very highly Lutheran. And they look back to their roots, to St. Thomas. They try to trace their lineage all the way back to St. Thomas. In the same way the Roman Catholics would, their clergy would trace their way back to St. Peter, all the Lutherans in India trace themselves back to St. Thomas. Finland, 4.303 million. Norway, 3.9. We are no longer the state church of Norway. It can be supported by the people's taxes, but they also can send their taxes to other nonprofits. Madagascar, this is where the church is really growing, the Malagasy Lutheran Church. Nigeria, see how, that's why I'm doing a special DVD next week on the growth of the church, the Christian church in Africa. And it's a DVD and it talks about. So you look up there and look at the African countries. Papua New Guinea, long-time mission of the old American Lutheran Church, and they have 1.3 million. Namibia, 1.2 million. Now, you know, most of the South Africans were Dutch Reformed, but in the Namibia area, the northern part, we had missionaries for years. Question?
Just to put it in perspective, for going back to Germany, using this methodology, the same methodology of counting Lutherans, 11.7.
Right.
How many Catholics?
In Germany, you might come up with about the same, maybe 15 million. They're not much bigger than we are.
Yeah.
Because when it divided up, the dukes I try to picture Germany as a large state. Let's say, that's pretty geographic, was Georgia or Ohio, something like that. And you have many counties in each state, just as we do here in Florida. You have all the different counties. At the time of Luther, all of those counties had a duke who was the county administrator, if you want to call it that, almost the county king. And they decided whether they were going to go with the Lutheran Church, Evangelical Church, the Catholic Church, or the Reformed Church. And so you get all that division taking place. Lutherans are pretty strong up in the north part of Germany. There's some down in the Black Forest, but not too many. That's more Reformed when you get down into southern Germany.
So to come up with these numbers, this is what the membership of the various congregations, and then total that
Yes.
up, and that's how you get these
Yes.
millions.
And 95% of all Lutherans in the world belong to the Lutheran World Federation, and they meet regularly, I think it's triennially, and when they come together, they come with their reports. Yes?
You have figures for Indonesia. Which one is it? 6 or
Oh.
2.4? There's an
I work
Indonesia.
long and hard at this, y'all. I would go with this one for Finland and that one for Indonesia. How I got these down in here, I don't know. But so just cross them out. What?
Lori said this, not me.
Oh,
She said you were watching a ball game.
I wasn't. I put in hours on this, and I'm going to tell you where to go for websites if you want to find out more about your background. You forget that. This shows you how we're spread throughout the world. The deep red, the darker red, is between 1 and 10 million people. And you notice down here, South America, Brazil,
People or Lutherans?
Lutherans.
Okay.
There are almost 1 million Lutherans in the country of Brazil. Okay, who do we cooperate with? The Lutheran World Federation is 90% of the world's Lutherans. We come together for scholarship, learning, exchange, speak to world situations. It's not a governing group, but it's a cooperative group. And invariably, the last 2 presidents that we've had of Lutheran World Federation have gone on early in their career to meet with the Pope and to talk about Lutheran Catholic relationships, which I don't know if we'll see in our lifetime, but they continue to grow. Lutheran World Relief is a division of Lutheran World Federation. And so if there's, say, a tsunami over in Indonesia, something, Lutheran World Relief would take charge of that. So in the Lutheran World Federation, you have some arms of help going out. Lutheran Disaster Response is what we call it in the United States. And here, thankfully, the Missouri Synod does cooperate with us on Lutheran Disaster Response. And some of them were here in Florida after the hurricane. And they're still in Puerto Rico, I should say, Lutheran Disaster Response. Lutheran Immigration and Refugee Service has been a long-standing group. It's existed for decades. Back in the 1940s, I can remember my home church having a German family come and locate in the city. When I was in Kalamazoo back in 1975, we sponsored several Vietnamese families who came, and we took charge, helped them find housing, helped them find jobs, helped them learn the English language, and they were in church every week.
No, just for comparisons, how does Lutheran Immigration and Refugee Service compare to, say, a Catholic Charities? The reason I keep bringing up Catholic Charities is because in the Washington, D.C. area, they are, if you want to sponsor anybody, you go through them. They're
the only one.
They're the very top dog, yeah.
But they only move out about as far as Pennsylvania.
Oh, okay.
And then they kind of peter off after that. Carol?
Our church, some years ago, sponsored a family from Somalia, but it was through Lutheran Social Services, and they called themselves Immigration and Refuge.
Right. Lutheran Social Services becomes a real part of this. They're the ones that implement what these people are able to discuss with the federal government and say, we'd like to receive so many people. When they receive them, then Lutheran Social Services. And we've had a lot of, I don't know how, a lot's not a good way to describe it, but quite a few Somali families have come. And I think there are 2 Somali Lutheran churches in Minneapolis, St. Paul.
I've heard that there's a lot of them in that area.
Yes. Okay, other related ventures as well. I'm going through these pretty quick so we can get to some countries. People ask, who do we have fellowship with? I'm going to put them all up there and then tell you what fellowship means. Okay, those are the 6 other denominations that we have fellowship with. Fellowship basically means that I can go and preach in that church, any of those, and they can come and preach in this church, any of those. It also means that I can participate in the sacrament in those churches. Now notice, it's not all the Episcopal churches, does not include small Anglican communion that is developed on the East Coast. Actually, their seat is in Charleston. Presbyterian Church in the USA. You also have another Presbyterian church almost of equal size, United Presbyterian Church of America. United Church of Christ, that's used to be the Congregational Church. Some of you might have grown up having a Congregational Church in your neighborhood, as well as maybe an Evangelical and Reformed, ENR. They merged to form United Church of Christ. We don't have a corner on mergers. The Reformed Church in America is located in Holland, Michigan. It's not real large, probably numbers in 600,000-700,000 as far as membership is concerned. But there's also a Christian Reformed Church that we do not have fellowship with because they think we're just too liberal. So We cooperate with the Reformed Church. They have a seminary in Holland, Michigan, and we have sent people to their seminary. They have sent people to our seminary if geographically it helps them. The Moravian Church. We added the Moravian Church in fellowship probably 12 years ago. Just dynamic, devotional, pietistical effort that really helps our church. They have their prayer life together. They have their daily devotional life together. You know, many of our pastors will subscribe to their devotional materials or go online that you can download their materials or look them up each day and see what they have to say. Not a large group. We'll talk about the Moravians coming to America when we get to the Germans. However, they're located, I believe, their office is Salem, North Carolina. If anybody knows where Salem, North Carolina is. United Methodist Church, we cooperate with, and we have been in negotiation is not a good word, and a lot of dialogue with several black majority churches, such as AME, African Methodist Episcopal, and the National Baptist group is also almost majority black. So those are the areas we're working on now. Any questions about fellowship?
We working on Missouri Synod yet or not? I came from this.
Repeat the question.
I'll give you my opinion, okay? After 52 years of being ordained, we've given up on Missouri. They just don't want to talk to anybody else. They want to be themselves. And we'll see the background to that today.
What about the Wisconsin Synod?
They're even farther. Yeah, right. Yeah.
If I don't get the microphone to them, you need to repeat their question.
Okay. Let me get rid of all those things popping up. She said, what about the Wisconsin Synod? Wisconsin Synod, as you saw, has 400,000 members. They absolutely do not allow us to take communion in their church. They never allow me to preach in their church. Missouri Synod is a little different. I mean, even though their hierarchy is very, very conservative still, they say the farther away you get from St. Louis, the more liberal the pastors become. And we did a lot in Kalamazoo, Michigan with the Missouri Synod, and we had joint services. Never had joint communion, but we had joint services. We did have joint communion among the pastors when we had a retreat, but not between churches. I'll just tell you one quick story about, we had a very large Missouri church in Kalamazoo. It was the largest Lutheran church in the city. They had about 1,200 members. Beautiful building. And Louis had been there. Louis Grother was their pastor, Pastor Grother. But I knew him as Louis. And he'd been there for I think he was there 40 years when he retired. But the bishop, their equivalent of a bishop district president, was in Ann Arbor, 100 miles away. And he found out that they were meeting together with us ELCA guys. And there were in Kalamazoo 3 Missouri Synod churches. And so the bishop came over, our district president, as they call him, and started really getting into Louis about what they were doing, meeting with other Lutherans like they were. Because we had joint Good Friday service, we had joint Reformation service, and Louis is quoted as saying to them, which church in Michigan gives you the most benevolence? Who contributes $100,000 a year to your budget? And the district president said, well, you do. He said, enough said. So we never heard from that district president again, I guess. Okay. From where and when the Lutherans came to America. So here's where we'll start. We're going to look at Sweden, Germany, Norway, Denmark, Finland. I said and others, but I don't think we'll get to any others other than what I've talked about. So they're not in the order that I'm going to present them. That's so you have to guess. So let's start, forget this over here. But who knows what flag that is? That's Norway's flag. Okay. So we'll talk about the Norwegians. The Norwegians. On July 4th, 1825, that's almost 200 years ago, the sailing vessel, I love this, Restorationen. They left Stavanger, Norway to come to America. Here's where Stavanger, Norway is, right down here at the bottom. So they didn't have far to go, and usually they made a stop at the United Kingdom and then kept on coming. Some Norwegians were already here when I practiced this at home. Would you believe that? Restorationen. Okay. It was a group of 52 men and women intended to set up a Norwegian colony in America. This was the new frontier. This was the promised land. From 1820 to 1860, a total of 36,000 Norwegians and Swedes came to America. They sometimes even came on the same ship. Then from 1861 to 1880, 250,000 Norwegians came to America. That's the big spot, probably where many of you can trace your ancestry back to that particular period of time. It's believed by 1880 that there were 500,000 Norwegians here, or offspring of Norwegians. The growth of the church was very rapid. In 1883, think about this, they came 1835, they already had 310 pastors serving 1,185 congregations. There was very strong growth among the Norwegian Lutherans. 193,000 members. The Restorationen group, I said it right, that group, they settled near Rochester, New York. And a year later, 2 years later, the entire group headed west. Some settled in Chicago, and others settled along the Fox River in Illinois. Elling Eilson and other Norwegian leaders. This is where it becomes important, not important. It becomes interesting as we begin to see splits among these groups coming to America. And they split according to their theology and what they learned at home and who were their leaders back in Norway. So Eilson came to America in 1839. In fact, I believe there still is up in Minnesota a very small group of Lutherans called the Eilson Synod that has about 15 churches in the Eilson Synod, very pietistical. He's called the father of the Norwegian Lutheran Church. This is what was neat. He was ordained by the German Lutheran Church in order to become the first Norwegian pastor in America. Don't ask me where they went and how this all happened, but these are facts that you can receive. He was a Haugenist who changed to a Grundtvig. Okay. Haugenism, Haugianers were very, very fundamental, very strict. The Grundtvigists were liberals. liberals only in the sense that they wanted to work with other people. They wanted to work together with other churches. C.L. Clausen, ordained by a Danish preacher in Denmark, came to America. Now, in the church I served in Wisconsin, I think we had 10 families named Clausen. Now, I'm Germanic in background and I 1/4 Scotch. Okay. Those people, it was a merger of a Danish and Norwegian church. And they'd come out. I learned names pretty well when I was younger. And so I'd say, "How are you today, Mrs. Clausen?" She says, "That with an E or an O?" Because the Danes put E's often at this point, and the Norwegians will put O's. That's not a rule that always holds, but most of the time does hold. I like this. He received no salary, but members of the congregations paid him an offering of 6 cents for every 40 acres of land that was owned by members of the congregation. And so if you owned 40 acres, you paid 6 cents. Of course, inflation happened, and later they asked 6 cents for every confirmed single man or woman in addition to those who had land where they farmed. J.W.E. Dietrichson was ordained in Norway, and he came to America for a very large salary of $250 a year. Now, I thought, when I wrote that down and I read it, I thought, no, I'll bet that was pretty large in those days. Then I went back here and I started 6 cents. How many 6 cents it would take to make $250? And it'd take a lot of them. It would take a lot of them. It would take about, you got to multiply 16 times 250, that many people to get the same that he received. The growth of Norwegians in America. Eielson purchased land in Middleport, Fox River, Illinois, and he built a small church. The church had a residence in the lower level, the floor level. It had a second story, and that's where the church met twice a week. The split of the Norwegians had already begun. I should have said already begun. About half of the pastors proposed to follow the teachings of the Frankian Evangelical Lutheran Synod and to unite with that body. They built a church in 1843 in Muskego, Wisconsin. That Muskego, Wisconsin is southwest of Milwaukee, 25 miles, you Wisconsinites, something like that. That church was later moved to Luther Theological Seminary at St. Anthony Park in St. Paul, Minnesota. They organized the Norwegian Synod in the Valley in Wisconsin. So that was half of the pastors. But they followed the teachings of this guy named Frank. The Northern Illinois Synod started a college in Springfield, Illinois. And they had the gall to call that the University of Illinois. Sounds strange, doesn't it? It was later taken over entirely by the state of Illinois. Groups of these Norwegians actually started Concordia Seminary in St. Louis, 1857. That's 10 years after the Missouri Synod settled in St. Louis, and Luther Seminary in St. Paul, Minnesota. And when we merged into the ALC back in 1960, the Norwegians were the largest group. They were called at that time the ELC. Okay, here are just a few other highlights of the Norwegians. The Augustana Synod, which I used to think was Swedish, was really Norwegian. And they built the Augustana Synod in Chicago and later moved it to Rock Island, Illinois. The first home for the aged. Any Wisconsinites here? I know you two are. You are? Yeah. Laura, you are too. The first home for the aged was built in Wittenberg, Wisconsin. Wittenberg is pretty central, I think, over toward Madison somewhere. And the first orphanage is built in Stoughton. Where is Stoughton, Wisconsin?
Just west of Milwaukee.
Just
Madison.
east of Madison, west of Milwaukee. So you see that was a congregations of people, of Lutherans in that area. Here are a few other leaders from the Norwegian Evangelical Lutheran Church. Gisle Johnson was a theological professor in Oslo, Norway. And he, in his teaching in Oslo, stressed the need for an experienced and living Christianity. Kind of like the Haugianers. You have to have a conversion experience and make full loyalty to the Lutheran confessional writings. Many pastors who migrated to America were influenced by Johnson. Johnson never came to America for a church, but he influenced many others. August Wienes, the first president of Augsburg Theological Seminary, which later merged with Luther, taught Johnson's theological system. So seminaries back in those days might have had a president and one other professor, or maybe it only had one professor. The background, the beginnings of my seminary in Ohio were Dr. Schmidt, Pastor Schmidt, who had 3 students, and that was the seminary in 1850. So we're not talking about humongous buildings like this, like we're in. We're talking about who was touching whom. And there's one teacher touching 3 or 4 people. The next year, maybe a couple of others would come in. Sven Oftedal, did I say that right? You Norwegians? He was a professor at Augsburg in 1873. And Georg Sverdrup in 1874 largely determined the spirit and the form of the Lutheran Free Church, which has split away from them. Pastor Lars Oftedal was a layman, and he led a lay-oriented Western revival. If any of these names ring bells to you or anything, raise your hand and we'll let you tell the whole class. Jakob, did I say that right? Jakob Sverdrup became a political leader of the liberal lay movement. So he was a pastor, and that's who they began to look to. Okay, here's another one. Who's this? Sweden. Okay. If you don't mind, I'm going to tie my shoe.
Okay. Should I need to tie it for you?
No, I'm going to tie it, but I'm going to cheat. He's waxed. Wax laces aren't too good. I did that one Saturday while I was preaching, and I was afraid to move. And somebody came out of church and said, "You didn't move around very much tonight." And I said, "I didn't want to step on my shoelace and fall down." Okay, this is Sweden. There are many overlaps between the Swedes and the Norwegians. This is the Swedish Lutheran Church in Rock Island, Illinois. No wonder, that's where Augustana College is. That's why I connected Augustana with the Swedes, even though Augustana was started by Norwegians.
Augustana's an LCMS school, right?
No, Concordia is the LCMS school. Augustana is one of our 26. What?
Repeat the question.
Repeat the question. He said, Augustana is Missouri Synod School. I said, no, it's one of ours. Well, wait a minute. He's probably right. We have an Augustana in Sioux Falls, South Dakota. That's where our Augustana College is. I knew we had one. Okay. Rasmus Jensen of Denmark was the first pastor to set foot on American soil. He died in 1620. He was a chaplain of, now don't worry, I didn't get this wrong, of a Danish expedition numbering 66 Lutherans. They took possession of land around Hudson Bay in the name of the Danish crown. However, the first Lutheran pastor to serve a colony in America was this guy. He was Rioris Torkillus, something like that, the Swede. Born in 1609 in Sweden, he was a chaplain at Göteborg. Gustavus Adolphus, of which we also have a college, King of Sweden from 1611 to 1632, a 21-year reign. He entered the idea of founding a Swedish colony in America. And his dream was to have a mission to those Indians who they heard about were there in America. Peter Minuet, who was a German, came to Manhattan in 1626 for the Dutch West India Company, and he led the first Swedish expedition to Delaware in 1637. 9 expeditions followed to Delaware. Some of them coming from Norway, some come up in New York. Delaware at that time was the equivalent of present-day Delaware, a little bit of Pennsylvania, and present-day New Jersey. That was what comprised Delaware back in those days. The Dutch captured it in 1655 for themselves. So we really didn't get a new Sweden in America there. But the Dutch were fairly good to us, and John Campanillas arrived in 1643. 3 years later, on the 100th anniversary of Luther's death, he dedicated the first Lutheran church in America at Christina, which is today Wilmington, Delaware. What he's famous for is he translated Luther's catechism into the language of the Delaware Indians. So he was accomplishing what the king really wanted to do. Peter Stuyvesant, who's heard that name before, I think we all have. He took possession of the colonies in 1655. He permitted the Swedes to retain a pastor. And another Swedish pastor came and labored among the Dutch 1671 and 75, but later moved on to do mission work among the Swedes and the Finns. King Carl XI of Sweden, he becomes kind of important because he promised to help these orphaned Lutherans down in Delaware. Remember, the Dutch had taken them over, and so the King of Sweden, he promises to help. And they appealed to him for help. They needed pastors. So 4 years later, finally, he sent a Pastor Rudman and 2 assistants as well as Bibles. Now, I'm just going to pause there for a minute to say this happens not only among the Swedes, but happens among the Germans, that they came and started cranking out their materials in their native language. And in so doing, they also made a lot of Bibles in their native language. Benjamin Franklin was very put out about this. And he talked about the putrid Lutherans because they wouldn't give him any business at his printing shop for the religious materials. And there were a lot of them being printed back in those days. So Ben wasn't Mr. 100% nice guy. He was fairly nice. Okay. New life entered the Swedish colony once the king had sent help. Trinity Church is erected in Wilmington, probably the first Lutheran church erected in the United States. Gloria Dei Church was erected in Wakako, which is now Philadelphia. Somebody have a question back there? Oh. But spirit, here it comes. Legalism, hierarchy, and unionism held back future growth. Because what happens is they start arguing with each other. They start fighting with each other. Fighting's not a good word. Arguing, dialoguing, but the dialogue is usually one-directional. The congregations were not taught to govern themselves. And so they were ruled by provosts sent from Sweden. How many went to a college where you had a provost? Or they have one now. My college did not have a provost when I went there, but now they do. The provost is the second in charge behind the president. Roger.
I was just going to say, perhaps a little bit early, but are Lutherans, or what about other religions? Are Lutherans...
The only ones fighting?
Yeah. My guess is no, but
Why don't we wait till we get all through them?
Okay, that's what I thought. Sounds good.
It's a good question, though. They were ruled by provosts sent from Sweden. Here's an example. 1702, Andreas Sandel introduces a system of penances. If you come to the church tipsy, you pay 40 shillings and do public penance, which means to stand before the congregation and say, you have sinned, you're sorry, please forgive me. If you could stand. Blasphemy of word or sacraments carried a fine of £5 and a church penance. Even singing at unseemly hours in your shower was punished by a fine of 6 shillings. Okay, here are some interesting pastors of the Swedes. J. Dylander preached the Gloria Dei. He preached in German, Swedish, and English every Sunday. And in the absence of a pastor or priest in the Episcopal Church, he would serve them as well. He got in a little trouble over that. So he is the one who probably became the father of unionism. Peter Tranberg was stationed in these two cities, New Jersey, and then he went to Christina, which was Wilmington, Delaware, until he died. The language question at this point becomes acute. What language are we going to teach in? What language are we going to learn? And Rangi, the provost, from 1760 to 1768, rejuvenated the Pennsylvania Synod, and he began a seminary with Peter Muhlenberg, who was a Lutheran. And we'll talk about that when we get down to the Germans. Okay, some accusations occurred. Unionism practice between Swedish Lutherans and Episcopalians was reported, I'm sorry for the old missing, by Pastor Sandel in 1710. Because he filled in at pulpits wherever he was needed. And he preached in English. And he went to Episcopalian cornerstone layings. He sang Swedish hymns, but they were during English services. And although differences were recognized in the Lord's Supper, they continued as brethren, so that the Swedish church ultimately is called a sister church to the Church of England, the Swedish Lutheran Church. The evil influence, this is what some said, the evil influence which unionism like that practiced is addressed by a resolution of the Pensneck Church in 1744, where their pastor wrote, "As to my congregation, the people at first were scattered among other congregations and among the sects which are tolerated here, and it is with difficulty that I gather them again to some extent. The great lack of harmony among the members makes my congregation seem like a kingdom not at one with itself, and therefore near its ruin." Therefore near its ruin. Should have quotation marks at the end of that. So that naturally leads to the final undoing of Lutheran Swedes in Delaware, which include New Jersey. Okay, the demise. Pastor Wrangel gave the final eulogy of Swedish Lutherans of Delaware. He openly and fraternized with Episcopalians, Reformed, Presbyterians, and Methodists. What a unionist guy, to do anything like that. And so, seeing the demise of Lutheranism, it led to his departure back to Sweden. And he offered the Episcopalians to use him as their tool, their deliverer of the poor, weakened, and oppressed Swedish churches, whose leader he had been, into the hands of the Anglicans. And so these become part. And he carried, and this clarifies it, he carried a letter to the Bishop of England which read in part, "Now Dr. Wrangel intends to utilize properly the general aversion to the Presbyterians in order to unite the great mass of Swedes with the Church of England, which, as you know, is but small numerically and in humble circumstances in this province through union with the German Lutherans. This would make us both become respectable." So you're beginning to see the spaghetti get all wrapped together here as you get into second generations. Swedish government, therefore, cuts off all help because they're going with the Episcopalians and because the Swedish tongue had come to an end. So one congregation after another united with the Episcopal Church. By 1846, the Lutheran name had pretty much disappeared from the East Coast. 1846, soon to return within a decade or two. 1.2 million Swedish immigrants came to America in those 30 years. They passed through New York and settled in the upper Midwest. Any people here of Swedish background? You ever hear of Vasa? Vasa is very strong social outreach, social services, and they tried to help the immigrants who were coming. This was interesting to me. Chicago was a city with the second most Swedes in the world to Stockholm. Only Stockholm had more Swedes than Chicago. The Swedish immigrants founded the Evangelical Covenant Church and founded North Park University in Illinois. Is that where you went? Okay, that's part of the Covenant Church. We have several pastors in our church who are Covenant pastors.
I wasn't Covenant,
but you went there.
high school and college.
All I remember about North Park, I'll tell you, when I went to school, we played against them in basketball, and they came in looking like giants. I mean, our biggest player was 6'4", and they had these guys come in 6'8", 6'7", and but we beat them, I think.
That's how you remember it.
That's how I remember. Yeah. Well, I kept score. Remember? Okay. They founded North Park University, which still exists. Is it called a university now, or
Yeah, it was North Park College.
college? Right. Almost all colleges are now. They're changing the university because all they have to have are two separate colleges.
It's gobbled up the whole area around, and there's a long-standing seminary there.
That's in northern Illinois, right?
Chicago.
Chicago area. Okay. Towns like Lindbergh, Kansas, they continue to celebrate Swedish heritage. The largest settlement in New England was in Worcester, Massachusetts. The town of New Sweden, Maine, still celebrates St. Lucia and Founders Day. Who can tell us about St. Lucia Day? What happens in church on St. Lucia Day? My wife is laughing. Tell us.
A young girl dresses up in white with ribbons coming down and
A tiara
tiara.
of candles that are lit.
We just had in our church in South Carolina a woman who was older than I was, who had never gotten to be the St. Lucia girl in her congregation growing up. So she asked if she could do it. A woman in her 60s.
I was so worried that her hair was going to catch on fire. It really was. But, you know, when in Rome, do as the Romans do. Many benevolent associations were founded by the Swedes, Cemetery Corporation, Lutheran Old Folks Home, Fairlawn Hospital, Scandinavian Athletic Club, and most of those still exist with more streamlined names than being associated with the Swedes. Okay, who's this? The Danish Evangelical Lutheran Church in America. I don't have too much on them other than the experiences that I've had I can share with you. They were formed in 1874. Schisms soon began. They began splitting with each other, the schisms. And so here they are. In 1893, the Pietists left the church, the Danish Evangelical Lutheran Church, and organized the United Danish Evangelical Lutheran Church in America. I notice all the play on words here. Strong Pietistic United Danish Evangelical Lutheran Church, that one was formed by a merger now with the Dane Evangelical Lutheran Church in North America and the Danish Evangelical Lutheran Church Association in America. All over what? Over pietism. You know, did you walk into church with your hands folded? Did you reverence the altar? You know, all these little things that get blown totally out of proportion. In 1946, the United Danish Evangelical Lutheran Church in America changed its name to the United Evangelical Lutheran Church. They are what we called the Holy Danes. The Holy Danes. They drank, they smoked, and they danced. They were the ones who didn't smoke, drink, or dance in their own homes. They had special clubs they went to. They merged with others, the ALC, ELC, and LFC, Lutheran Free Church, to form the American Lutheran Church in 1960. They were a part of us, or we were a part of them. Those remaining in 1893, way back here when the Pietists left, were the Grundtvigians, and they followed Grundtvig. And Grundtvig, of course, was more of a unionist. He wanted to get along with other people. And so in 1954, the Danish Evangelical Lutheran Church in America changed its name to the American Evangelical Lutheran Church. They were the Happy Danes. They drank, smoked, and danced. In 1962, they merged with this group merged with others to form the Lutheran Church in America. They merged with the United Evangelical Lutheran Church and 3 others. Finally, both groups get back together in 1988 when the ELCA is formed. So you see how we're bringing some of these groups back together in this day. Okay, who's this? Somebody ought to know that. That's Germany. Okay. The beginnings, I went through some of this last week. Several Germans were among the settlers at Jamestown. Doesn't say they were Lutherans, it says they were Germans. Peter Minuet, a German, came to New Amsterdam to serve as governor of the Dutch colony, New Netherlands. He later governed the Swedish colony in Delaware. We've already mentioned him. 13 families of German Mennonites seeking freedom arrive in Pennsylvania, purchase 43,000 acres of land. Anybody here from Pennsylvania? They founded Germantown, Pennsylvania, which still exists. So, the Mennonites? The Mennonites, they were just an offshoot of the Lutherans in Germany, a little bit more pious.
They're not like the Amish, though.
No. They're not that far. Many small German-speaking groups came. They're coming from different places. They speak different dialects. So you've got the Swiss Mennonites, Baptist Dunkers, the Schwenkfelders, Moravians, Amish, Waldensians, all these groups who followed other leaders. I mean, there was no way to communicate in those days. The only way you could communicate was by writing and by Pony Express, and even if you had that, it wasn't that good. Protestants, this becomes big. They were expelled from Salzburg, Austria in 1731. Some 31,000 Protestants were expelled from Austria. 300 of them came to America. Not many, but 300.
Why were they expelled?
For not being Catholic. Okay, the first group of that 300 arrives in Augsburg, St. Anna's Lutheran Church in Augsburg, Germany, traveled down the Rhine River to Rotterdam in the Netherlands. They were met by 2 pastors, and with 37 families, they board the ship Purisburg and journeyed to America, 1734. This was the first Salzburger transport. That's not the name of the ship. That was the name of the group, and many more followed. The Moravians, we talked about them. We're in fellowship with them today. They founded Bethlehem and Nazareth, Pennsylvania. Notice the names of these places. Now, how about this one? 1784, John Jacob Astor left Germany, arrived in the United States with $25 and 7 flutes. He amassed a fortune from real estate dealings and fur trade. The time of his death in 1848, he was by far the richest man in America, worth $20 million. 1790, by now there were 100,000 Germans had immigrated to America. Most of them were in Pennsylvania and Maryland. The Rappists in 1840, they came. They're an interesting group that you never heard of them by the name Rappists, but that's what their name was when they came. They purchased 30,000 acres in Indiana and founded New Harmony, Indiana. How many have heard of New Harmony, Indiana? Okay, it was socialism where they shared everything together. It was good socialism, you want to call that. But they returned to Pennsylvania and founded Economy, Pennsylvania, 20 miles west, I love that name, of Pittsburgh. They founded other towns by other religious groups in this period, including Zor, Ohio. How would they ever get a name of Zor, Ohio? My brother's funeral or memorial service was held at Zor Lutheran Church in Perrysburg, Ohio, up by Toledo. Zor, Ohio is over closer to Pennsylvania. It's south of Canton and Akron over there. And it's named after a city in the southeast corner of the Dead Sea, the Salt Sea. And supposedly, that Lot's wife is where she turned into a pillar of salt. Okay, so we have Zor, Ohio. Most of you have heard about Amana, Iowa. Again, a cooperative. And St. Nazianz, Wisconsin, I never heard of. You did, Ron? Where is it?
I don't know where, it's toward, well, it's northwest of Milwaukee, northeast of Milwaukee.
Northeast, up toward Door County?
Yep. And there was a really,
Peg's got a microphone.
this isn't Bible State, but there was a really good basketball player that came out of St. Nazianz.
Oh,
I can't remember his name now, but he'd score 50, 60 points a game.
oh,
Type of guy.
how about that? Yeah, in Wisconsin. Well, who did we have in Ohio? I can't remember what his name was, down at Rio Grande College. He scored 102 points in one game. They just fed him and fed him. Bevo Francis.
Oh, yeah.
Bevo Francis. This is 1821. The Germanic custom of the Christmas tree is introduced in Lancaster, Pennsylvania. St. Nick's Sinterklaas evolved into Santa Claus. The Easter Bunny and Easter eggs are also brought to this country by German immigrants. Okay, here's a few other happenings. Nearly 1 million Germans immigrate to America in the 1850s. Between 1850 and 1860, nearly 1 million Germans immigrated. The next large immigration was in the 1880-1890 period of time. Adolphus Busch settled in St. Louis, married the daughter of a prosperous brewer, and ultimately evolves into the Anheuser-Busch Brewing Association, it was called. And they still make Busch beer. Busch Light, Budweiser, Ultra. They make a lot of different kinds. Okay. By 1890, there are now 2.8 million Lutheran-born immigrants living in the U.S. Not all were born in Germany. They were located in what was called the German Triangle, Cincinnati to Milwaukee to St. Louis. So that creates the triangle. Cincinnati and the Ohio River up to Milwaukee, down over to the Mississippi River, and that's where most of them located. And so that's why you end up having such things as the Iowa Synod, the Illinois Synod. This is interesting. Coming to power of Adolf Hitler. This was new to me, and these are only a few of the names. Many German scientists, writers, musicians, scholars, and intellectuals escaped to the United States, including Albert Einstein, Bruno Walter, Hans Bethe, Kurt Weill, I should know that name, Billy Wilder, if you follow, he was in the movies, wasn't he? And Marlene Dietrich, who was an actress. And there are others that came during that period of time. The Bureau of Census in 1990 asked people what was your descent? And 58 million Americans claimed to be solely or partially of German descent in 1990. What was the population?
What was
I'll
the
have to
total
look that one
population?
up. I'll have to look that one up. Yeah, probably is important. But it would put us at more than 10% of the population. I'll have to look that up.
Us? Put us? So are you saying you're German?
I am three-quarters
Okay.
German, yes. In 1990, I must have had to answer that question on the census. Okay, religious happenings now weave through all this history that we're talking about.
250 million.
How many?
250 million.
215 million.
250.
50. So you're looking at 20% claimed German ancestry, which could be Catholic, which could be Reformed, or could be Lutheran, or nothing. There is an argument when the Salzburgers traveled to Georgia, 37 families, 1932 or 1934, but they founded the new town of Ebenezer. And they laid it out similar to Savannah. And in 1967 to 1969, the Jerusalem Lutheran Church made bricks from area clay, the bricks being something like 20 inches wide. And that church still stands. So if you get going up Georgia towards Savannah on I-96, you'll see Rancon, R-A-N-C-O-N, and Ebenezer is close to that. That's the city. The Muhlenbergs become important. They are probably, to the Germans, the most important family to come to America. H.M. Henry Melchior Muhlenberg replied to a call, he was in Germany, from the Lutheran churches in Pennsylvania, and he came to the United States. He functioned as the overseer of all Lutheran churches from New York to Maryland. He had 3 sons. John Peter Muhlenberg was a Lutheran pastor and a brigadier general of the Continental Army. He commanded the infantry at the Battle of Yorktown. He's the one who stood in the pulpit and took his robe off and had the general's uniform underneath it. Frederick Augusta Muhlenberg, the second son, was also a Lutheran minister and served as a member of the Continental Congress and the first Speaker of the United States House of Representatives. And then the third son, Gotthilf, boy, why didn't he name him James or something? But anyway, the rest of them have good names. Gotthilf Henry, he was a Lutheran pastor and a botanist and the first president of Franklin College in Lancaster, Pennsylvania, which is now known as Franklin and Marshall. I have great thoughts remembering the offer they made me for a scholarship. And I thought it was too far from home because it would have been about 150 miles and going over the mountains to get to Franklin and Marshall. But they were NCAA Division III, which I ended up in at Capital, and they couldn't offer athletic scholarships, and so I was offered a math scholarship, which I was also offered at Capital. So that's how I played on the golf team. Hi, I'm your local mathematician. Grandsons then, sons of these sons, also became Lutheran pastors or Episcopal priests. And one becomes the first president of Muhlenberg College, only fitting. The difference led at that point. Now we have 2 developments of teachers from Germany, Schmucker and Krauth. And so it leads to the start of 2 seminaries, Gettysburg Seminary and Philadelphia Lutheran Seminary, Schmucker, he wanted to move to English culture. Croth wanted to keep German confessionalism. The interesting part about this, I don't know if I have it, no, I don't have it up there, is 1 year ago, in 2017, those two seminaries finally merged. They're now called United Lutheran Seminary. But to show you what background does, they teach on 2 campuses. They only have one administration who goes back and forth, but they have 2 campuses. Okay, here we go. Finally, we get to the Finns. Okay, any Finns here? Okay, I'll be quick on the Finns.
They're all in Upper Michigan.
Yeah, they were a nation state, Finland, created in the closing days of World War I. Before that, they were governed by Sweden, who then, in turn, kind of went a little bankrupt or whatever, trying to govern them, and Russia took them over until right after World War I, they become their own state, nation state. About 90% of the Finns are Lutheran. There are about 29 million Finns worldwide. Most still speak some Finnish. 6% are Finnish Swedes. That would go back to when they were governed. Also known as Swede Finns. I don't know what the difference are. They have minority groups, the Sami, about 4,400, and the Lappish, Laplanders, you've heard of that. They live in the north. The Gypsies live in the south. And so you get Laplanders and Gypsies. Roger.
And never call a Finnish person a Scandinavian.
Oh,
That's like calling you the worst you can think of.
oh, I didn't realize that.
We had a Swedish, or rather a Finnish au pair for, for a year, and then through Catholic Charities, while they were redoing the immigration in '86, and it kept dragging on, which was great. We just kept filing tax returns, and she stayed with us for altogether 8 years.
Wow, okay.
But
Do not call them Scandinavian,
Scandinavian. No.
even though they're located up there. Okay. The first Finns in America came as colonists to New Sweden. You know, they were working with the Swedish. Quickly adopted American ways. They did away with the huvies, the scarves, and they began to wear wide hats. The men wore bowlers and stiff starch collars. Sound very Norwegian to me. They went west to the Midwest and erected log cabins on barely scattered lands, barely cleared lands. And they tried to cover all their houses as they got enough money with white clapboard. And just that was their style. In efforts to assimilate their customs that could remain invisible, in other words, like the rest of the world, those were maintained. Berry picking, hunting, trapping, woodworking, all these things that other people did, they maintained. But they also had their love of the sauna, and still do. The mining districts of Upper Michigan, the Copper County, receive the largest share of Finnish immigrants. And I think I mentioned before that when the merger came about in the church and we were setting up synods, the Upper Michigan Synod took in some of Wisconsin over to the Minnesota border, and there were 76 congregations, 75 of which had Finnish background. There was one German Lutheran, Norwegian Lutheran background down by the bridge, way on the eastern side. St. Ignace. No. That's not St. Ignace. Where we crossed the bridge there.
Yeah, it's St. Ignace up above in the map now.
Oh, okay. So I had it right. Okay. The Finnish Evangelical Lutheran Church was commonly known as the Suomi Synod, organized in Calumet, Michigan, 1890. Calumet is even north of Houghton Hancock, which is on the Keweenaw Peninsula. They established Suomi College and Theological Seminary in Hancock. It's now known as Finlandia University. They merged with Lutheran Church in America in 1962, and at that time they had 36,000 members, 105 pastors, 153 congregations. Okay, worship was carried out by Swedes and Norwegians until a pastor was called from Finland. They organized congregations, he organized Beckman, and took missionary trips to Minnesota and Iowa to get those people. He stayed 7 years, and he returned to Finland to live out his life. And another pastor, Johan Nykander, answers the call. He did great work. He's a great background to the Finnish Evangelical Lutheran Church. Taught a lot of confirmation, baptized a lot of kids, and did all the things that pastors were supposed to do. I won't read, you can read this, it's on your paper. When they adopted their Constitution and came into being in 1890, you can look in the middle, it was to revive true Christianity. They confessed the Christian faith based on the Word of God, books of the Old Testament, New Testament, creeds, and the Augsburg Confession. Exactly what our Constitution says today here at Hope Lutheran Church. The Holy Word of God is the only rule and standard by which all doctrines of the church are to be tried and judged. That's basically where we are today in the ELCA. Okay. Hey, I made it. I didn't think I would. Next week we're going to look at African Christian Rising. We'll look at stories only from Ghana, which is a church that the Christian church, not just the Lutheran church, but Christians have really begun sprouting up. But look at that. There's one of their churches. If you've ever been down the Bahamas, you've probably visited some islands where there were churches that looked like this. So, that's all I have.